Hypotheticals are fun. I like hypotheticals, especially sports hypotheticals, because we don't have to. It doesn't really matter, right? Like at the end of the day, it's people playing a game. It doesn't necessarily. It's not a life or death situation. But there are some that just become exhausting and stupid, frankly. I don't know how many times over the course of the last probably 3 weeks, I have heard the argument that if Indiana were in the SEC, if Indiana were in the SEC, if Indiana were in the SEC, Indiana's not in the SEC. You cannot decide who does and does not make the college football playoff on imaginary scenarios. You can't do it. If Georgia was in the Big Ten, they'd be undefeated. Well, we have really no way of knowing that because they might have lost to somebody that you wouldn't expect them to. And that stuff happens. Did anybody on the planet think Alabama was going to lose to Vanderbilt? No. Did anybody think Ole Miss was going to lose to Kentucky? No. Did anybody think Tennessee was going to lose to Arkansas? No. And all of those things happened. Did anybody think Indiana would be 10-0, working on 11-0 against Ohio State? That when coming into the season, did you think that Ohio State versus Indiana would be a game that decided college football playoff seeding? Hell no, you wouldn't have, even in the most hypothetical situation. Because the games on the field are what has to matter. And so, if Indiana was in the SEC, they might be 3-7 instead of 10-0. But you know what? They are not. I feel really confident that if Indiana had played Arkansas, that they probably would have won, or Kentucky, or Vanderbilt. Just like you're confident that if Indiana had to play Georgia, or Tennessee, or Ole Miss, or LSU, or insert whatever SEC school here, that they wouldn't win. It's the same thing. And yet, the only thing that has mattered, should matter, and does matter is what happens on the field. Would Indiana beat Texas A&M? I have no idea. To truthfully answer that question, I don't know. I know Indiana's pretty good. Have they benefited from playing the 6 worst teams in the Big Ten? Absolutely, undeniably. Did they benefit from having a really bad non-conference schedule? Undoubtedly. But the idea that if Indiana was over here instead of over there, things would be drastically different doesn't and shouldn't matter. What happens between those white lines is what should matter. And so, if Indiana wins all of their games or all but one of their games, that should matter as much if Indiana's one loss is to the number 2 ranked team in the country. I want you backtrack with me. I want you to close your eyes. If Mississippi State was 10-0 and they finished 11-1 and their one loss was to a number 2 ranked Georgia or LSU or Alabama, Auburn, Florida, Oklahoma, Texas, pick whichever top tier SEC program you'd like, you would be ridiculed if your argument was they didn't deserve to be in the college football playoff, especially an expanded 12-team playoff. You'd be called a lunatic. And you know what? Because you should. I'm not here to say that all conferences are created equal, because they're not. Obviously, we know that. We even know that in the Power 4, there's a hierarchy. There are the top 2, and then there are the Big 12 and the ACC. We know those things. But I'm here to part of the reason, I'm getting worked up. Part of the reason that Indiana is being viewed as lesser than or undeserving of a playoff spot is because they're Indiana, because they don't have any football history of success outside of about a 5-year window in the late 1980s. And that's why I used the Mississippi State example. You could throw in Vanderbilt. You could throw in South Carolina that don't have the strong football traditions that the big dogs in their conference do. So Indiana is not even not a blue blood. I don't even know what the hierarchy of colors would be in the bloods, but whatever about like teal mixed with tan, whatever color that is, I'm certain ain't pretty, but that's the level of blood Indiana football is. And thus, if it was virtually anybody else if Michigan State, if Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, Wisconsin, Iowa, Nebraska, USC, Oregon, Washington had the resume that Indiana has right now, this would not be a question. There would not be a discussion of, are they deserving or not? And I've changed my tune on this because a few weeks ago I don't think they're being treated unfairly. But when there's already starting to like set the stage of, here's why 11-1 Indiana is going to play in the goddamn Citrus Bowl instead of the college football playoff, while 10-3 Georgia gets in, I'm going to have an issue with that because, yes, are Georgia's losses explainable? Certainly. If you lose the SEC championship game and you lost to Alabama and you lost to Ole Miss, very good teams, I understand that. Then why the hell does Indiana losing to who is conceivably the second best team in the country some gigantic disqualifier? Because what Georgia has done, which is lose to very good teams. Do you know what Georgia has in common with Arkansas or with insert whatever SEC? Let me pull up the SEC standings here. Do you know what Georgia, if they were to lose for a third time, and I think that's, we're putting the cart way before the horse. But do you know what Georgia losing to two good teams in Alabama and Ole Miss have in common with Florida this year? They both lost to good teams. Losing to good teams doesn't make you good. And that logic and argument, Georgia losing to good teams means that Oklahoma is really good this year. And you know what? Your eyes tell you that that's not the case, that Oklahoma is not really good this year. They are not. They are not having a good year. But the idea that we're going to use hypotheticals that, well, if Indiana played Georgia's schedule, is Georgia's schedule difficult? Yes. Undeniably, it is difficult. But you know what? You got to handle what's put in front of you. Indiana could control exactly 3 games on their schedule. Georgia can control pretty much exactly 3 games on their schedule. They play 8 conference games, and I'm not going to ever denigrate Kentucky for playing Louisville or Georgia for playing Georgia Tech, Clemson for playing South Carolina. If you have those rivalries, those games that you play every year, I'm never going to run them down. I know that there are people who will say, well, in the past, Georgia's schedule has sucked because look at their non-conference, and then they play Georgia Tech. Those are the good things that we should want more of in college football. We should want those rivalries to persist. The fact that Texas and Texas A&M are going to play again this year is awesome. The fact that Nebraska has played Oklahoma the past couple of years, has played Colorado the past couple of years. Those are good games. We should want those to continue. So I'm not going to run somebody down. I'm not going to say Louisville should someday punt Kentucky off their schedule to try to make the college football playoff or anything like that. I want more of those games, and I think you probably should too. There are very few times on this show where I'll tell you this is how you should think. You should think that regional rivalries, games that happen every year, that your Pitts, West Virginias, or games like that we lost because of conference realignment and hubris, should happen. I think you should think that. So I'm not going to run Georgia down. Georgia had 3 games that controlled their schedule, just like Indiana had control of 3 games of their schedule. Georgia doesn't get to pretend as if, well, if we were in the Big Ten, because that's not a reasonable argument. You can't go into, hey, what's your sales pitch? What's your resume for why you should get to be in the college football playoff? Tennessee can't go say, well, if we played Indiana's schedule, yeah, and if you know what, my grandma had wheels, she'd have been a bike. We don't get to play those hypotheticals because we have real tangible proof and evidence of what the hell happened on the field. And what the hell happened on the field should be what matters most. Not, well, if, to hell with if. Indiana's 10-0. If Indiana finishes 11-1, should Indiana be in the college football playoff? Yeah. And I know that the counter argument is, well, all it does is then tell the committee telling the teams they shouldn't play anybody in the non-conference. Yeah, that's been the message for 30 years. That's always been the message. A few years ago, Oregon lost to Auburn to start the season, and Oregon had a really good season that year. But you know what? After losing in week 1, we punted them out of the college football playoff discussion. You know why? Because they had a loss. Oregon would have been much better served to play East Jesus Tech Nowhere that weekend, and they might have been in the discussion. It has always been, you shouldn't play anybody in the non-conference. You know why? Because the lesser number in the loss column, 9 times out of 10, is going to be preferred over somebody who has a different number. The one time ever was when Nick Saban was about to retire. Everybody knew he was about to retire. We can pretend as if we didn't. Everybody knew that last season was Nick Saban's last hurrah. We could pretend that we were shocked in January when, oh my gosh, he announced his retirement. I knew that he was going to be joining College Game Day for this year in October of last year. I don't want to talk about how or why I knew that. But if me sitting here recording this in my spare bedroom on a YouTube channel knew that that was going to happen, do you think the College Football Playoff Committee didn't know that was going to happen? So Alabama got into the College Football Playoff outside of Florida State, who, if Jordan Travis didn't have a leg that had a 90-degree angle in it, would have gotten Florida State into the College Football Playoff. But all of those circumstances hit like a perfect storm, and for the first time pretty much ever, the team that had 0 losses got jobbed over somebody who had a loss. But I'm here to tell you that 9 times out of 10, that the College Football Playoff Committee is not going to have the cojones, berries, testicles to do what they think. What they think is, I would bet you $1 million that they think Indiana's probably the 15th or 16th best team in America. But they've got a goose egg in the loss column. So you know what? That propels them above Georgia, LSU, Alabama, Tennessee, Ole Miss. And if the argument from the SEC side has always been, if you just win all your games, you don't have anything to worry about, you then can't come back and bitch when somebody else wins all their games and you go, well, that's not fair. It is. That's what happens between the lines, and that's what has to and should matter. So I'm sick of the, well, if Indiana was in the SEC, they are not. And Georgia's not in the Big Ten. And Kentucky and Ole Miss and Vanderbilt and Arkansas also are not in the Big Ten. There are schools that are equal to those. And you know what? If Oregon had lost to, hell, Illinois is better than Arkansas. If Oregon had lost to Michigan State, I can't imagine somebody saying, well, hold on, that's a quality loss. The hell it is. The hell it is. It ain't. A loss is a loss is a loss, and a win is a win is a win is a win. Now, that doesn't mean they are equal, but a bad loss in conference, you don't get to excuse away because, like, well, we had a tough game before that and after that. Sorry, that's the way the cookie crumbles. I'm done with, well, if Indiana was in the SEC, it's poppycock, balderdash, whatever are nice ways to say it's bullshit. And instead of calling out the bullshit, we entertain the idea of, well, hell, what if Indiana was in the SEC? They aren't, they haven't been, they never will be. So we don't have to waste time on discussing what might have been, could have been, hypothetically speaking. What happens between the lines is what matters. And if Indiana wins all their games or all but one of their games, I don't know how you argue that their one loss, while they might not have a great win, that is a fair, absolutely, objectively valid criticism. If your one downgrade on your resume is, we lost to the number 2 team in the country on the road, how in the hell do you keep that team out of the college football playoff? I don't think you do, and I don't think you can. Because if that's the standard that we're going to set, there are going to be SEC teams down the line, and Big 12 and ACC teams, for the record, too, that are not going to like that standard someday when it affects them. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content we're pumping out. If you're listening on the podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. Goes a long way in helping out the channel. I'll see you tomorrow for another episode of the Daily Huddle.